Excellencies, distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome back. Let us now move to the second session, which will address global and macroeconomic challenges to overcome gender inequalities in employment and earnings. This session will focus on the importance of macroeconomic and social policy coherence to achieve gender equality in employment conditions and income. While the goals of gender equality have been notionally embraced in practically all policy arenas, research in this field shows that achieving gender equality requires decisive and well-designed policy action, public policy action, that traverse not only the social fabric but also the realm of national and global macroeconomics. Research also shows that even operating under serious constraints, policy choices can be made to effectively contribute to gender equality and to improving the social conditions that make that possible. What is more, macroeconomic insights into this question serve to underscore that many of the efforts made in this area should not be seen as cost, but as true investment broadly understood in the way in which we analyzed in the morning, with meaningful multiplier effects on the aggregate economy. I should add some elements from the Trade and Development Report of the previous year that regarding trade liberalization. Trade liberalization can have contradictory effects on women and on gender equality. In labor-intensive export industries, for example, such as garment manufacturing, there has been a feminization of employment, but the women are often stuck in low-wage, dead-end jobs with limited opportunities for skills development. For this session, we have with us today three world-renowned experts in this field, and I am pleased to introduce them to you and to invite them to share with us their insights on these issues. Jill Rubery is Professor of Comparative Employment Systems and the Director of the Work and Equalities Institute at Alliance Manchester Business School, University of Manchester, and a Fellow of the British Academy. She has worked extensively for the European Commission, coordinating its gender and employment expert group for around 15 years, and for the International Labour Organization. Her research focuses on the interdisciplinary comparative analysis of employment system, with a particular focus on labor market segmentation, low pay, working time, and gender equality. She has published extensively on these topics. Her more recent books include European Employment Models, The Welfare State and Life Transitions, and Women and Austerity, the Economic Crisis and the Future for Gender Equality. Professor Rubery will share with us her views on why we need a global deal for gender equality. Then we'll have Ipek Karacan. She is Professor of Economics at Istanbul Technical University, Faculty of Management, and a visiting researcher at the University of Roma Sapienza in 2018-2019. She's also a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute in New York and an associate editor of the academic journal Feminist Economics. Ipek holds a BA in Political Science from Swarthmore College, Pennsylvania, and a Master of Arts and PhD in Economics from the New School for Social Research in New York City. Her research areas include the care economy, work-life balance policies, economics of time use, gender, and macroeconomics. She's also a member of the advisory board of International Women's Rights Action Watch, Asia Pacific, based in Malaysia, and a founding member of Women for Women's Human Rights, New Ways, an NGO based in Istanbul. She will focus in her presentation on investing in the care economy, a gender equitable strategy for employment generation and inclusive growth. And third, last but not least, Professor Maria Karamesini. She is Professor of Labor Economics and Economics of the Welfare State at Pantheon University of Social and Political Science at Athens, and since March 2015, head of the Greek Public Employment Agency. She has been the president of the network of the careers offices of Greek universities from 2001 to 2008, the scientific responsible of the first graduate survey in Greece, and currently the scientific counselor of the Greek Ministry of Education for the Euro Graduate Survey at Pantheon University as well. She has been recently an external collaborator of the International Labour Office for some research projects, including the World of Work, welfare state, and the relationship of industrial relations and labor policies with inequalities. Professor Karamessini will share with us her views on the improvement of formal childcare under harsh austerity, the Greek paradox. Having said so, now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Ruri. Professor Ruri, have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just wait till people...
Oh. I told you. Students. This is
yes.
This is an association. This is a kind of...
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. And welcome to our new guests. What I want to talk about today is why we need a new global deal for gender equality. Some of you may know there is a discussion about needing a new global deal, and I thought maybe we should add a global deal for gender equality. And what I want to talk about today is first of all, these 5 questions. We all know that women are nowadays making major contributions to the economy in all parts of the world. And what I'm going to look at first is what is the nature of that contribution and how could it be enhanced? What are the problems that women are facing? And then turning in particular to, are women receiving fair and adequate support and rewards for that contribution? Looking at 3 areas: from the state, from companies, from the household. My third question is, to what extent have the recent economic crisis and austerity policies actually exacerbated problems that women have faced, or has it reduced gender inequality? And then from that, I will then draw some conclusions about what would be the key elements in a new deal for gender equality. And then a large part of my talk will be under the point 5, which was how could a new deal have benefits for women and the wider society? So looking at it from the perspective of, yes, it's beneficial for women, but is it also a case that we can make that this is actually beneficial for everybody and for the macroeconomic goals that we were talking about this morning? So I'm not going to spend too much time on women's current economic contribution. What this data shows is the size of the gender gap in women's and men's labour force participation by region between 1995 and 2015. And you can see that in most cases, with I think Southern Asia the main exception, the gender gap in participation rates has been declining. But we also heard and used, in fact, saw exactly the same graph earlier today, that actually the gender gap in unpaid care work is much greater than that gender gap that we were seeing in wage work. I realise I forgot to say to you, you can see that it varies quite considerably across different regions, that obviously in the Arab states, Northern Africa and Southern Asia, the gender gaps are very more significant than elsewhere. So each region has different problems. But we can see from the slide here that actually men are, sorry, I can't really read my own slides on this thing, of only providing 83 minutes compared to around 250 minutes of unpaid care work. So there's a much bigger difference in unpaid care work. And we have to recognise that the unpaid care work is ensuring both reproduction of the existing workforce, so helping to reproduce the men who go into the labour market as well as the women, but also ensuring the quality of the future workforce in the form of children. So the contribution is very significant, but what we want to think about here is what are the limits to the contribution. And the first limit is that many women want and need to work, but they face an inadequate infrastructure for care. And therefore, many women are not able to work in the wage economy because of their care responsibilities. And I think it's the ILO Care Report recorded that 606 million women of working age have declared themselves to be unavailable for employment or not seeking a job due to unpaid care work. Well, that compares to only 41 million men worldwide, 41 million to 606 million. So we can see that where the underutilised, if you like, in terms of wage work, labour force is. I'm not suggesting these women are underutilised in the sense that they're doing very valuable unpaid care work, but many of their talents that they want to use in the wage labour market are not being utilised. And those women who do participate in the labour market face limited opportunities, often in education, particularly in the developing countries, or in the labour market due to their care responsibilities and, of course, the discrimination. Women with care responsibilities are also more likely to be self-employed or in the informal sector and less likely to contribute to social security. So you can see that the women who are carers are less likely to be among wage and salaried workers than women who are non-carers. So there are those problems that women face, and of course the inadequate returns to women's work in terms of their wages and the continuing gender pay gap means that there are fewer incentives necessarily at the level of the household and the community to invest in women's education and their involvement in the workforce. It's interesting actually that in developed countries at least, there isn't so much a lack of investment in education for women, but somehow it becomes too costly to utilise that education. Actually providing subsidised for childcare and things is seen as a high cost, even though actually we've invested a lot in these women already in their education. But the underutilisation of that human capital is not seen as such an issue. So these are some of the problems. And then if we also look at whether they receive fair and adequate support and rewards from that economic contribution, if we first of all look at what women get from companies, we know that in global value chains, the returns to women's labour is often squeezed, particularly when that labour is provided in developing economies context. And we can see that the estimates for the amount of employment involved in global value chains is huge, contributing about 20.6% of total employment in the OECD countries and the BRIC countries. And this does not even include workers in low-income developing countries or lower tiers of value chains. So actually doing something about how women are rewarded within global value chains could be argued to be a major way in which women would get fairer rewards. And it's not necessarily possible within the context of developing countries to do that on your own, that actually there needs to be recognition that the low rewards going to women workers is part of a global value system that we need to change. Another way in which companies are not necessarily providing fair and adequate support for women is that they may impose what I've called penalties for not conforming to a male breadwinner model. I just use here examples from the United Kingdom. There are many examples where if women want to request to work flexibly or work part-time, they may be asked to take a different kind of contract, to accept, for example, a 0 hours contract with no guaranteed hours. The BBC, that everybody has heard of, I'm sure, in this room, actually asked some women presenters who wanted to go part-time to become self-employed and set up their own companies and give up their permanent job as the price of being allowed to work flexibly. So what I'm suggesting is that companies actually impose a penalty on women who want to work in a different way, and that penalty is often disproportionate to any costs that the employer might actually incur. In fact, they may benefit from women working flexibly, but because they're asking for something different, they have to pay a price. And then there is, of course, as I've already mentioned, the persistent gender pay gap. There's a low value often attached to wage work undertaken by women, especially if associated with care work or domestic work, and including in some countries work associated with public services. I did some work on the public sector in Europe and found under austerity, and particularly in Eastern European countries, the level of pay going to professional workers in Eastern European countries was extremely low. And this is something we're not really talking about, that actually people in public services may be inadequately rewarded for their work. And often this is women's work. It's when the public services are dominated by women that this problem often arises. And finally, although it's not my area of expertise, but there's obviously a failure to take action against sexual harassment. And I think this ought to be mentioned as well each time in our post-Me Too society, that this is a problem that is persistent. And then from the state, we can also see that there is an inadequate reward and support for women. There's an inadequate support for care in the form of infrastructure and in services. I'll say more about infrastructure later. The value of unpaid work remains hidden, and therefore it's not properly valued and understood. Many countries provide either no or very limited credits for women's unpaid work in calculating entitlements to social protection. I recently doing some work on comparing 6 European countries, and the number of years of credits that women get for looking after a child can vary from sort of like 1 year to 12, and so it's highly variable as to whether or not countries take into account women's role in bringing up children as something that is then rewarded in the social protection system. The state also is involved in setting minimum wages and public sector pay. Minimum wages are normally not set at what I would call a living wage level. This is becoming an important issue, I think, in developing countries, but also in my own country, in the UK, there is a strong living wage movement, but the actual current minimum wage is well below that. And this is important for women because more women are paid at minimum wages than men. And I've already suggested that the public sector is a very important area for women's employment. And under austerity, there were many wage freezes and wage caps, and no recognition that some women's jobs are considerably underpaid in public services professions such as nurses and increasingly as doctors, because many countries have now majority of women are doctors, and you can see some correlation with the pay going down even at the top end. And I would also argue that there's limited efforts by the state to extend employment rights to female-dominated sectors. There have been some successes, for example, in formalising domestic work, but the impetus for that, I think, came from NGOs and trade unions and through the ILO, and then the state may have, in some countries, may have contributed, but it's not something that all states are doing and something that could be considered. And then I also included the household and community, because it strikes me that a lot of the pressures that women face in terms of trying to combine care work and wage work partly come from expectations from the household and community about how women should behave and how their obligations. Fulfilling social norms and expectations increase pressures on women who are trying to combine wage and non-wage work. Caring for the elderly, caring for the family, just putting the family first. All these things are important, but there are also cultural expectations that I'll come back to again in a minute. There's also limited evidence that men are contributing to household and care tasks. And of course, unequal pay in the wage labour market limits women's bargaining power in the household. So these things are, you can actually see change potentially coming through the labour market into the household. And while women are underpaid in the labour market, it's very difficult for women to exercise equal power in the household. So just a few comments on has the experience of austerity post the financial crisis exacerbated problems. Well, I think Maria Karamessini and I are the joint editors of the book on women and austerity, and we found that women's economic contribution has been taken for granted in Europe during the cuts in public expenditure that followed the austerity policies that followed the financial crisis. And it was not really explored what the impact on women would be of cutting back in provisions for social care, cutting back in public sector employment. So these are major problems that have been facing women recently. Also, the changing nature of labour markets. I think people are not necessarily observing how maternity leave, for example, in developed countries, which is based on the assumption of a continuous employment contract, is no longer likely to provide support for all women as we move towards more precarious work and more self-employment. As I've already suggested, the cutbacks in the public sector, particularly in Europe after the financial crisis, were not really recognised as a gender issue. And although it is increasingly the case that the international organisations, the IMF, the OECD, have seen the potential for women to make a macro contribution to growth, they haven't necessarily, therefore, reassessed their traditional macroeconomic policies of fiscal constraint and labour market flexibility, and how those may be not actually reducing women's potential capacity to contribute. So on the one hand, people are recognising that more women in the labour market makes a macroeconomic contribution. I think we still have a long way to go in international organisations at understanding what their policies of public sector, public expenditure restraint and labour market flexibility might have. So, from that brief analysis of some of the problems, what would I see as the key elements in a new deal? And I think from the point of view of companies, we're talking about revaluing women's work within global supply chains, more flexibility in the way in which work is organised to enable women to retain jobs within the formal sector, so they're not excluded because they have care work. Less use of outsourcing to informal lower-wage sector that exploits women's needs for flexibility. That's part of the penalty of wanting to work part-time, that actually a lot of part-time jobs are organised outside of high-paying firms. More concern for due process and women's rights, including the right not to be sexually harassed. And then, coming to the role of the state, here I'm drawing on Ruth Pearson's argument that if women are going to participate fully in the wage labour market, there is a need for a new social reproduction bargain, and the state needs to step in to support social reproduction. It's not plausible that this is going to happen through a change in the gender division of labour at the household for various reasons, not least the fact that men aren't necessarily able to reduce their hours to share care work because of employer policies. So we need the state to step in to provide for care, to support care, and not provide all care. And we need to recognise the need for investment in care services, but also recognise the productivity of that investment. We need credits for informal and unpaid work and social protection systems, and we need support for action to formalise employment and extend employment rights, including the rights not to be harassed. And then at the household and community level, it seems to me there are various cultural changes that we still need. We need to strengthen women's rights to hold income and assets to increase their bargaining power in the household. This applies in some countries more than others. We need support for women's education, where that is still partial. And we need action to change gendered social norms. For example, there's been quite a lot of discussion of women being segregated during menstruation times of the month, and problems over mixed workplaces and sexual harassment. So all of these social norms also need to be acted on, which is a wider societal need. So that's what I would want to see as a new deal, but I think I have to make the case of how might this benefit not just women but the wider society. And I do believe that actual gender equality has benefits for all. And these are the 5. So, shortage of time, I will just let you read those 5 and go through them in turn. First of all, there are benefits from raising the gains for women and for developing economies in global value chains. And what I've done here is just find some examples from the literature and from cases. And this is an example from the Kenyan flour industry. It was actually done by colleagues of mine in Manchester, Stephanie Barrientos and Laura Bianchi, and Kerry Burnham from the Ethical Trading Initiative. And they found that actually the ethical trading initiative going into the Kenyan flour industry led to sound gender policies on workers' rights, training, promotion and grievance procedures, participatory social auditing, converting women's workers from temporary to permanent workers, etc., etc. But the key point, and I won't go, you can read it as I'm talking, is that more women became supervisors and managers. There was a reduced reporting of labour abuse and sexual harassment, and procedures for reporting and remedy were enhanced. But it was also lower labour turnover, more committed skilled workers, higher productivity and higher quality. So we get benefits at the level of the company through these interventions. So this is just one example. And then we have examples that I won't dwell on because we already heard about them this morning, and they will be addressed again this afternoon by other speakers. But there are macroeconomic benefits from investing in a care economy. I'm a member of the UK's Women Budget Group that has an F plan, feminist plan, which found that investment in the care industries would generate approximately twice as many jobs as investment in the construction sector. We've all probably heard of Keynes's argument that you can start digging holes and doing construction work if you have a deficiency in demand. People don't talk about investing in care, and I think this is an important issue. The ILO Care Work Report, as I said, which I just again you saw the same slides this morning, shows that actually just keeping the status quo, the increased demand for care would lead to a growth of 152 million jobs, but an additional 117 million if we invest to fill gaps in care that exist. So it's a huge potential generator of jobs. Now, I said earlier that I wanted to talk about infrastructure for care because I'm very struck by this work by Lourdes Benaria, which was about how investing in care infrastructures really make life so much easier and efficient for those who are providing care, and it's not really considered. And this is about thinking about the local economy, where care services are located, how even things like access to water is provided. And the argument here, as again, it's probably too much for me to read out from beginning to end, is that these measures are providing local daycare, local schools, providing access to neighbourhood health centres, community services, leisure facilities, improvements in public transportation, paved streets that make it easier for people to move about, greater access to telephones and other factors would aim. The main point is that these will aim at saving time for household members, especially women, who tend to have the greatest need to reconcile different types of work. And these benefits are often hidden and not taken into account in investment decisions. And this table that she provided too shows on the left-hand side the different capabilities that you might want to enhance: being able to raise children and to take care of others, being able to work in the labour market and other projects, being able to be mobile, being able to engage in leisure activities, being able to exercise autonomy in allocating one's time. And then she documents what these local facilities might achieve, and you can see many have 3 pluses, saying this would make a major difference to women being able to do these things. And this local perspective, I think, is really important. And then I also think that the benefit comes from the human capital benefits from the New Deal, that women would be more able both to acquire and utilise their education, and that this also has spin-offs for the education of children themselves. And again, I provide an example here where an Italian NGO in a poor neighbourhood of Quito in Ecuador targeted parents of children from birth to age 5. The programme empowered women in various dimensions, including higher labour force participation in employment and higher likelihood of a full-time job in the formal sector and higher wages. And what you can see is that women themselves grow and take responsibility, more capacities, but also do the children. And finally, we all benefit if everybody has more social protection. And actually, a new deal for gender equality would lead to more formalisation of employment and extension of rights. And what we can see here from this chart is how domestic workers and total employees are covered by social security. And you can see the real disparities that in some countries, domestic workers are hardly covered at all. But note at the far end, we have Uruguay and Costa Rica, which show with much higher ratios of coverage for domestic workers. So it's not something that's impossible. It's something that we could aim for in a New Deal. So to conclude, what I'm arguing is we need a New Deal in all countries and regions. The priorities in that New Deal will differ. Countries are at different starting points. What they need to do first will be different. But we need, in all countries, to make care work more visible in macroeconomic policy, not assume that women's work time is infinitely flexible and that withdrawal of state support or failure to provide support has no consequences. And we need to continue to address the issue of the undervaluation of women's work, which involves redistribution within countries, between men and women and between the rich and the poor, but also between developed and developing economies through global supply chains. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Rubery. Very interesting points. I'm going to check into detail the example of Quito as well. So, as you can imagine, I was very curious about that. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Ikara Jan. I'm sorry about that. Ikara Jan. Yeah, I'm sorry. Please, you have the floor.
So I have picked 2 points from this well-prepared background note for this meeting that sets the intervention points for my presentation today. The first one is an assessment with respect to a challenge on the labor demand side and then a challenge on the labor supply side. It says, given the employment challenges associated with structural and technological change, which is basically pertaining to the decreasing elasticity of growth to generate jobs, the demand side, the challenge on that demand side, and women's primary responsibility for both paid and unpaid care work. And this is referring to a challenge on the labor supply side, particularly for women's labor. The restrictions on women's time, given this dual responsibility. Transforming care activities into decent work, the background note says, should become an integral part of strategies aimed at building more inclusive economies. So this is an important entry point for my presentation. But then the question is how to do it. And the how is actually entailed in the assessments in the background note with respect to the relationship between fiscal policy and employment generation. Fiscal policy as an important tool of employment generation. It's emphasized all throughout that we need proactive fiscal and industrial policies, not only like fiscal in the macroeconomic sense, but also supporting industry sector development policies. And that fiscal spending should become, the note is very clear on this, should become the single most important ingredient in public policy for employment creation. And then it brings the gender issue into the picture, saying that the type of spending also, where you spend, also matters. It's not only the amount of spending, but which sector you spend, particularly spending on social services, in particular in care activities, generates much higher multiplier effects on employment. And this assessment actually comes from a recent series of studies, research studies that started flourishing in the past decade. The very first one actually was published in 2008, looking at the linkages between public investment, fiscal policy, public spending, social care, service infrastructure, employment generation, and inclusive growth. These studies basically undertake a policy simulation, sometimes on a country basis, sometimes on a multi-country basis, exploring the economic impact of an increase in fiscal spending on social care service expansion in terms of short-run and demand side, labor demand side outcomes. Why this? Well, because for years, for decades now, feminist economists, women's rights activists, advocates have been arguing for social care service expansion in order to promote gender equality in the labor market. But that argument pertained very much to the labor supply side. We were saying because care activities impose such a binding constraint on women's time, and therefore labor supply, women do not have, even when they do participate in the labor market, they do not have equal access in terms of contributing their time, committing their energies, etc., to achieve the same level of employment, the same level of wages, and also the same level of decision-making as men. For decades, we've been saying this, and it wasn't catching enough attention. Somehow, we were not infiltrating into the mainstream. So I think these studies came from an effort to get the mainstream, including both the orthodox and the heterodox mainstream, by the way, to become a little bit more engaged with feminist claims for social care service expansion. We said, okay, beyond gender equality, actually social spending, increasing spending, fiscal spending on social care has benefits for men as well, through what? Through generating jobs, through employment generation, through income generation. So for the first time with these studies, the attention was drawn to the linkages between social care services, availability of social care services, and the demand side, jobs generation, and economic growth. So these studies typically look at employment creation, as we've been hearing since the morning, but also some of them look at distributional effects in terms of poverty reduction and also distribution of jobs and incomes beyond gender by also household income and socioeconomic status and education level. And they typically compare, they take a baseline, they compare the what-if scenarios of what if the government is to increase spending on social care services versus if it were to increase spending of the same magnitude on construction and physical infrastructure. There is one, this is the typical comparison case. In one study on the USA from 2010, the comparison is with respect to green energy, because it was at a time when the Obama government was starting a fiscal stimulatory spending program, and the main idea was to spend on physical infrastructure and green energy infrastructure. And there was an intervention saying, what if some of this money was also to be spent on social care service expansion? And in the Turkish case, which is the study that I've been the most involved in, we also looked at, in addition to comparing it to physical infrastructure, we also compared it to the case of increasing government expenditures on cash transfers, because in the Turkish case, the increasing spending on construction projects and physical infrastructure projects and also cash transfers to poor, low-income households have been two lines of fiscal expansion in the past decade and a half, and very controversial also because the government was critiqued for using the cash transfers in a populist manner. Okay, so I think I don't need to spend much time on this. When we say a social care service infrastructure, we're basically talking about a whole range of services for children, elderly, ill, disabled, ranging from daycare centers and preschools to home-based care services, active living day centers for elderly, disabled, as well as residential centers. Now, the studies go through three steps of analysis. The first one is the assessment of the care deficit in line with certain policy targets, and then estimation of the cost, how much it would cost the government to close that care deficit. And in the meantime, I should also emphasize that because it came up several times in the question and answer session in the morning, when we undertake the assessment, estimation of costing, we also ensure a certain quality of services as well as decent employment conditions. So we do the costing not on the basis of replicant, just increasing care services, on the basis of existing labor market conditions, existing wages, existing service quality, but we do an adjustment to quality and also to quality of services and also employment conditions. The second step looks at employment generation, which is at the aggregate level, which is what we've been hearing about. And as I said, some studies undertake an estimation of the distributional outcomes. So these are, I'm moving on my own laptop, but not moving on the screen. I'm so sorry. Okay, so here I am. So these are the studies that have been taken, that have been conducted so far. The South Africa and USA studies were actually led the way. They were the original studies by Rania Antonopoulos and Ki-Jung Kim and colleagues from the Levy Economics Institute. Then, through a collaboration with the Levy Economics Institute, we undertook the Turkey study, which is what I'm going to focus on today. And then there's a second generation of studies, let me put it that way. And the reason I say second generation of studies, because while these first three look at both aggregate employment as well as micro-level distributional outcomes, the second generation of studies just pertain to the basically aggregate employment generation effects and distribution of only jobs by gender. That's the extent of the distributional impact that they look at. This other one, which is the most extensive study so far, was undertaken as an input to the ILO Care Jobs Report, which one of the authors, Valeria Esquivel, is here, and which has been, Valeria, it was referenced by pretty much all the speakers in the morning, and now again Jill and me. And we undertook, my colleague Ki-Jung Kim and I undertook the estimation of the employment generation effects. And these are the last two that are coming up, which haven't been published yet. Okay, so the Turkish study was actually, the Turkish context was a very good context for undertaking of such an exercise. For a number of reasons, because first of all, there's a structural, what I call dual jobs challenge that Turkey faces. Not only the labor force participation is very, very low, one of the lowest in the world, because it has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world, not the male. The male participation rate is on par with OECD, but the female participation is globally one of the lowest. But in addition to that, it has also very high and increasing unemployment. The time use gaps, the gaps in unpaid time are also among the largest, and a lot of the research shows that women, although they enter the labor market in huge numbers, even at lower education levels, end up dropping out of the labor market upon childbirth or marriage or taking care of elderly parents, etc. The social care service sector is highly underdeveloped. And finally, as I've mentioned, there is Turkey has gone through a fiscal expansion phase, including the stimulatory spending in response to the global crisis, but which was mostly done either on physical construction, infrastructure and construction projects, or cash transfers, or increasing public employment in municipalities, in administrative services. Okay, so what we did is, first of all, we assessed the degree of the care deficit, and we particularly looked at early childhood care and education services and preschool education services. So these are the enrollment rates for underage 3, 4, 5, and 6. As you can see, it goes from as low as 0.2%. We don't even have official statistics on this. We had to dig this up. The numbers and find the rate of enrollment for underage 3 to only 9%, 32% for ages 3 and 4, and only around 51% by age 5. As a policy target, we set for ourselves the OECD average enrollment rates, which is 33% for the youngest age group, and then 70, 84, and 94% enrollment rates up to age 5. And the level of the care deficit was such that we found Turkey needed to provide an additional childcare places for 3.3 million additional children. It's a big country with a big population. So in order for Turkey to achieve the OECD average enrollment rate, this is how much it needed to increase the places in childcare centers. And then we did a costing, and the costing actually, depending on the method of costing, ranged from about 1.2% of GDP to 1.8% of GDP. So it's a substantial amount, the amount of increase that we're talking about. And so let's see what we found when we compared a hypothetical increase of spending of this magnitude in these three different areas. And I'm going to, for limitations of time, I'm going to focus on the first two comparisons. Okay, so first of all, what we found is that social care spending generates about 720,000 new jobs versus only 290,000 jobs by construction spending. So you basically create 2.5 times more jobs per lira of spending on social care versus construction. So the difference was quite substantial. On top of it, out of these new jobs, 73% go to women in the case of social care spending. In the case of construction, look at this, as little as 6% go to women. So, I mean, there's a gender imbalance in both, one to the advantage of women and the other one to the advantage of men, but the imbalance is even more so in the construction case. So not only did social care spending create substantially more jobs, 2.5 times more jobs, both for men and women, but also it had a much more pro-women composition of demand. So as I said, we adjusted the costing so that the jobs created in social care, early childhood care and preschool education, that's what ECCP stands for, would be mostly decent jobs, but we didn't have much control over the indirect jobs, because when you spend on social care, you don't only create jobs in the social care sector, but also through backward linkages, social care services procures inputs from other industries, so you also create jobs in the other sectors. So we couldn't control how many of those jobs were decent jobs. So what we found was about 85%, majority of the jobs created through this spending were decent jobs, whereas in construction it was just the opposite. Majority of the jobs, as much as 70%, that also goes to say something about the profile of the construction sector jobs in Turkey, are indecent, informal jobs which are not covered by Social Security and which are temporary contracts. Then looking at the distributional impact, so there were many different dimensions that we used, but again, for limitations of time, I will just look at the only two things, the poverty and the gender gaps effect. One simulation where we did a targeted expansion of social care geared towards low-income households, children in low-income households, and also inactive or unemployed people in low-income households. We found that social care spending actually through such a double strategy had the potential to decrease poverty by as much as, depending on your poverty measure, from 1.14 to 1.42 percentage points, which is a substantial impact. Whereas construction spending had somewhere ranging from 0.35 to 0.52 percentage point decrease in the poverty rate. As far as the gender gaps are concerned, before that we also did a fiscal feasibility assessment, because the amount of money, the magnitude of the spending is huge. So obviously the first thing that the Ministry for Finance is going to question is about the feasibility. So through a very limited feasibility assessment, which took into consideration only the tax revenue increase that came through demand-side employment generation impact, without taking into consideration the impact that would come through what we call induced effects, increase in household spending. At a minimum, we found that about 1/4 of the initial outlay of expenditures would be recovered by the end of the year through increased tax revenues. In the case of construction, this was only 6%. And the difference has to do with two things. First, because this sector, the social care, child care sector, is a lot more labor intensive, so there are many more jobs generated, whereas construction, it's absorbed more with imported intermediate inputs and other intermediate inputs. And the second thing is so much of the employment in construction is informal employment. So that was one of the reasons for the difference. And one estimation taking into account, the induced effects, we found that this recovery rate increased to as much as 39%, from 25 to 39%. Okay, so finally, the gender gap impact, which for me is one of the interesting outputs of this study. What we found is that spending on social care had the potential to decrease the gender employment gap, the overall employment gap, by almost close to 1 percentage points, only through the demand side effects. We are not taking into account, because obviously once childcare services become more available, there will be also many positive labor supply side effects, enabling more women to remain in the labor market and become engaged in self-employment or undertake entrepreneurial activity, etc. So this is only through the demand side effect. Had the potential to decrease the gap by 1 percentage point, whereas construction spending had the opposite effect of increasing the already large gender employment gap, which is in Turkey currently is above 40 percentage points, increasing it by a further 2 percentage points. So this is how much it matters for gender inclusive growth, where you spend the money and how you allocate what is the sectoral allocation of your funds. With the gender wage gap, the social care spending, we found, has the capacity to decrease the gender wage gap by 2.5 percentage points. Construction also did, because the types of jobs created for women in construction were higher professional jobs, whereas for men, they're low-wage jobs, but by less than a percentage point. One negative impact of social care spending is that it increased industrial job segregation. Why? Because the social care sector, the child care sector, is a predominantly female sector. So by creating a lot of female jobs there, you're basically increasing further segregation. The index increased by 1.8. But in the case of occupational gender segregation, it was the opposite. It led to a decrease in the occupational gender segregation. Okay, so how am I doing with time?
Another 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. So, coming back to the famous ILO care jobs report that everybody is raving about since this morning, maybe a little bit more detail as to what that study did. Well, by the way, the employment generation was only one of the 6 chapters, right? So there's a wealth of information on other aspects also of care jobs and care work in the other chapters. But what this chapter did was the following. It compared the high road scenario with what we call the high road scenario with a status quo scenario. So this was the comparison. There was no comparison to physical infrastructure or construction spending. The high road scenario was a policy simulation under which we asked the question of how much it would cost the governments to expand care services in education, including early childhood care, in health, including long-term care, in order to ensure that Sustainable Development Goals 3 on health, 4 on education, 5 on gender equality, and 8 on decent job creation are all simultaneously met. Of course, the targets are not very concrete under all these SDGs, but we ended up using a whole range of international documents and data in order to develop more concrete targets under these. and how much it would cost the governments as compared to the status quo scenario where if everything stayed the same, I mean, the rate of coverage, the rate of enrollment, the quality of services, the quality of employment, if it all were remain the same until 2030, how much would the governments would be spending? And if they were taking the high road, what would be the additional expenditure? And then we asked the same question in terms of what would be the number of direct jobs in the care sector and indirect jobs created through backward linkages in the other sectors. And with respect to the employment generation, this is what we found. An additional 117 million direct care service jobs and indirect care-related jobs, so care service sector-related jobs in other sectors would be created if governments were to increase fiscal spending on health, long-term care, education, and early childhood care so as to meet the SDG targets by 2030. So substantial, so about 1/3 increase in the number of jobs as compared to the status quo from 358 to 475 million jobs. In terms of the spending, the status quo scenario found that estimated that by 2030, if everything stayed the same, the governments would be spending about 15% of their GDP on the care sector. Whereas in the high road scenario, to meet the SDG targets, they would have to increase it by 3.4 percentage points to 18.3% of GDP. So not all that much, actually, to meet the SDGs. But by the way, this analysis pertains to 45 countries. It was said 49 this morning. It's not 49. 45 high and middle income countries. And women's share in total employment is more than half, about 55 to 54%, depending on the sector in the high road scenario. So actually there's substantial amount of 45% of the jobs that would be created would be for men. So there's a substantial amount of job creation for men as well, embedded in the potential of the social care sector. So basically, to wrap up, one of the questions that came up in the morning is, where is this money going to come from? Will it entail a fiscal expansion? I think before we even move on to that question, one of the initial points to start from is about thinking about a rebalancing of fiscal budgets. Rebalancing of spending when a government decides to undertake a stimulatory spending package, for instance. So much of the time, the exclusive focus of stimulatory spending is on physical infrastructure and construction. So even by looking at the possibilities for a reordering of fiscal priorities, a rebalancing of sectoral priorities, I think we will be already starting to create some space for additional spending on social care. And I say towards a virtuous cycle of inclusive growth, meeting multiple SDGs, and not only 1, 3, 4, 5, and 8, but also 10, SDG 10, which has to do with inequalities by region, by country, and by socioeconomic status. And by the way, these are again only pertaining to the short-run demand-side effects. There are all these other effects that Jill mentioned and some of the other speakers this morning mentioned about investing in human capital through better, higher quality childcare, enhancing children's capabilities, workers' capabilities, increasing productivity, and leading also to supply-side growth effects. Not only the demand side, but the longer run supply-side growth effects, both through enhanced human capital of children and also women's increasing access to equal opportunities in the labor market, increasing female labor supply. And let me finish it on this note. This was supposed to come up as a white background, but I don't know why this projector changed the color. One of the speakers in the morning talked about 4 sectors for the future of work: the green economy, the blue economy, the care economy, and the digital economy. I would like to replace the care economy with another color, purple economy, as I call it. Purple coming from the symbolic color of the feminist movement in some countries around the world, including Turkey, which is where I come from, and also resonating so much of the terminology that we use with respect to an ecologically sound economy, which is the green economy. So a purple economy, in my definition, is a gender egalitarian vision of a caring economy, that puts actually care at the center of the economic structure, and it is built on these 4 pillars. And I wanted to emphasize this because it also came up, it was brought up by the speaker from Brazil, I think, that the universal social care infrastructure by itself and demand-side measures by themselves are not sufficient. We also do need the supply-side measures to resolve the issue of gender equality. So labor market regulation towards reduced work hours for all, for equal gender incentives for care, for men also taking care leave, such as paternity leave. These are very important parts of the overall gender equality deal, as Jill calls it. And the one pillar, which is for for less developed rural settings, actually, investments in not only care economy, but also physical infrastructure, time-saving physical infrastructure for rural women, and then an enabling macroeconomic environment, which is such an important point in the Unctad background note. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Sorry, also, I experienced the same problem, but thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. You share with us a life experience from Turkey, and thank you very much for this insightful presentation. Now we'll hear now from the third panelist, Professor Maria Karamasani. Is it correct? So, Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Okay. Let's study a specific case, a national case of how the care economy behaves during austerity. I'm going to speak about the Greek case, and I'm going to show how, although Greek governments implemented between 2010 and 2018 harsh austerity policies, at the same time they took measures that not only prevented the care crisis, but also laid the foundations for a new care economy. So this paradox I'm going to develop and I will start by mentioning the main characteristics of the Greek austerity experience, which is unique. Let's first see why this austerity experience is unique. For 2 reasons. First, because of the size of the fiscal consolidation effort, and the duration of the fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation was equal to 21% of GDP in 4 years. And this fiscal consolidation was extended over a period of 9 years under 3 economic adjustment programs. At the same time, fiscal consolidation was accompanied by a wage devaluation of 20% as part of what we call the internal devaluation process, which is meant to bring down prices starting by wages. So wages were reduced by 20% in 4 years in order to bring down prices by 20%, which was not, the promise was not kept because prices didn't follow from wages. The fiscal consolidation package included a reduction in social spending by 25% between 2009 and 2014. And at the same time, a whole package of labor market deregulation measures were implemented. So this austerity experience is unique because of these characteristics. And these characteristics have led to a depression, which is a state-led depression. It has nothing natural. It was produced by the state under the supervision of the Troika. This means the international institutions, European institutions, and the IMF. So between 2010 and 2013, an austerity recession spiral was generated by this kind of policies, and this austerity recession spiral had devastating economic and social effects. In 2015, the newly elected left government tried to exit austerity by negotiating with the European institutions and the IMF. It didn't succeed. You very well know the imposition of capital controls, of the bank closures, etc., the menace of Brexit from the Eurozone, and had to compromise and sign a third economic adjustment program in the summer of 2015. This third program was different from the two previous ones in the following dimensions. There were no wage cuts, further wage cuts introduced under these programs. The public spending was stabilized. This is after negotiations and a firm insistence by the Greek government, the left government. And the primary surpluses that were to be generated would be generated only by tax and privatization revenues, and mostly by indirect taxes. So we have a milder austerity period, which has led to economic stagnation in 2015-2016 and an economic recovery in 2017 and 2018. And during this period, we had a rise in employment by 8%, which was a surprise to everybody because of stagnation and a mild recovery, economic recovery. And at the same time, the unemployment rate was reduced by 7.5 percentage points, which was also a surprise. I will discuss later on why these figures are there, but we can discuss also if you have questions about this dimension of the crisis, the Greek crisis. Here on these graphs, you can see the devastating effects of the crisis, the economic depression and the employment crisis. The unemployment rate, which went up from 8% in 2018 to 28% in 2013. And if you take the gender dimension of the crisis and show the following graphs, you can understand why we say that the deterioration of both in the conditions of both women and men have led to a reduction of the gender gap in employment rates. As you may see, the male employment rate has declined more than the female employment rate. At the same time, the women joined the labor market in great numbers, great numbers. The female activity rate has increased during the crisis. This has happened in previous crises as well. Women step in when men lose jobs, and they have contributed to many jobless households to have an earner in the household. 12% of households during the Greek crisis were headed by women. This is a new phenomenon, the female-headed households during the crisis. The most important indicator showing the devastating effects of the crisis is the escalating poverty. The poverty rate climbed from 28% in 2009 to 36% in 2014, and this development has triggered the revival of social policy under the left government. In the past 4 years, this rise in poverty has led to a series of measures in different policy fields. For instance, we have had an extension of public work schemes that became the main employment policy tool between 2014 and 2018. A social solidarity income, which is a version, not the neoliberal type, but a more social democratic type of GMI, of guaranteed minimum income, was introduced for the first time in 2015. Another measure, a very important measure, was the free access of 1/3 of the population which was previously deprived from health insurance to the national health system. Many people who were self-employed lost their jobs and closed their practices, and they lost also their health insurance. So 1/3 of the population during the crisis lost access to the health insurance. So this measure under the left government this was one of the first measures, gave access to the totality of the population to the national health system. So we have now a universal coverage of the population by the national health system. The national health system at that time was in a state of collapse, so we applied special employment schemes, public employment schemes, in order to provide the needed personnel for the survival of the national health system, because the Troika had imposed a very strict hiring rule to the public sector. Only 1 out of 5 quits were replaced by hires. So 1 hire for 5 quits. You can imagine what was the impact of this hiring rule. The public sector lost 28% of the personnel. So we had serious problems in the national health system that were covered by the special employment schemes. Again, the state as employer of last resort. Okay. A problem which appeared during the crisis was a care deficit, because the impoverished lower income groups were unable to pay fees to municipal nurseries, and the middle classes were unable to buy private care services for children and the elderly. So to face this care deficit, as early as in 2010, the first year of the austerity programs, the governments took measures to provide free access of mothers to child care services. A very important figure and indicator which triggered a series of measures is the rise in child poverty. Child poverty surpassed the rate of the general poverty rate. It reached 38% in 2013, which is a huge rate. So this fact led the left government to take measures of child policy, and this was a new field for the Greek state. And under austerity, the austerity program, the third economic adjustment program, the expenditure on child poverty increased by 72%. This was a priority field of social policy for the left government. And the steps taken and the measures taken, the most important measures are the following. The child benefits were reorganized. The benefits for the first and second child were introduced for the first time in 2012. But the most important measures were taken after 2014. And in 2018, you may see there has been a rise in... I cannot do it. I cannot point it. Okay. A very substantial rise in the expenditure on child benefits, 2018. A second measure was the free access, the program of free access to childcare services that I mentioned before for low and medium income families. A third measure, a very important one, is the extension of compulsory preschool education from 1 to 2 years, which was initiated in 2018. And the last important measure was the program of free school meals to primary school pupils that was initiated in 2017. So the left government gave a great priority to child policy and family policy. As you may see on this, on the first panel, the graph, the program of free access to creche and nurseries was initiated in 2009. But until 2018 and 2019, the number of places, of free places, were almost multiplied by 11 times. So this program, which was initially designed for the very poor, gradually extended to cover the whole care deficit that was created by the crisis, by the austerity phase of the crisis. And so this program was extended from the low-income families to the middle-income families. And as I will tell you afterwards, this program is to cover the whole social demand for care, for childcare in the next 3 years. So what is the impact of this program? The coverage of children aged 3 to 6 by childcare services, by formal education and care services, passed from 69% in 2010, the first year of the austerity period, to 84% in 2015. And the coverage rate for children under 3 from 8% to 21%, which is spectacular for the austerity period. If you take into account that this was a very, very important, not very, very important, very, very harsh austerity that we experienced in Greece during these times. So the second impact you may see on this graph is that the employment rate of mothers fell less than the employment rate of mothers without children. There is a mistake on the graph, without children, okay? So the employment of mothers was protected in some way. Okay, and this means that the employment impact of motherhood was narrowed, and in 2013 it turned to slightly positive. This means that the mothers have a higher employment rate than the non-mothers. So let me conclude by saying the following. The crisis caused a great care deficit. The governments wanted to support families and also to combat child poverty as a priority. So they slowly by slowly they took measures to not consciously in the beginning, but this was built in the last 4 years. They gradually moved towards a comprehensive child policy, which is included in the National Action Plan 2018-2021 for children, National Action Plan of Child Poverty for the combating of child poverty, which includes the very important measures, the full implementation of the second year of preschool education by 2021. This means that all 4-year-olds will be in public kindergartens. The full coverage of children under 3 years by formal care services by 2021. This is the recognition of, and there is a recognition of the obligation of the state to provide to all children quality care. The third measure, important measure that has started from last year is the subsidization of municipalities to create additional places in public creche and nurseries and improve the quality of infrastructure. 1/3 of municipalities in Greece have already made use of these subsidies and they have already increased their places. And the fourth measure is the full coverage of primary school children by free meals at school by 2021, because the government thinks that that eating at school and providing meals for all pupils is a very important measure for pedagogical also reasons, to create social relationships and between among children in schools. So this is a good thing for the children. It is something that was triggered by school children fainting during the classes. There was a massive phenomenon of fainting, of children fainting in schools because they didn't have breakfast and they went to school and they were fainting. So the Ministry of Social Solidarity and the Ministry of Education, they started to provide meals to the children that were fainting in these schools in underprivileged areas. So from this measure, this anti-poverty measure, sprang the idea of extending it for all schools, for all pupils, and turning it from anti-poverty measure to pedagogical measure. This, as I have described so far, from an anti-poverty policy with a priority to children, we have passed to a comprehensive child policy, which is laying the foundations for a new care economy in Greece after the completion of the crisis. In 2018, we have exited the austerity, formally exited the austerity period, which is very recent, in August 2018. Already, child benefits have increased for 2019. We are moving towards a care economy where the public-private welfare mix is going towards the public and against the private. I mean, we are moving in favor of the public versus private in this mix. There is no gender equality perspective in this child policy. We have gender effects, but it's not a conscious goal of this policy. So it's child-centered, and there is no gender equality perspective.